Welcome to this Essential Skills for TDD presentation. I actually had a lot of problems teaching test-driven development to developers during TDD boot camps, and I realized you had to break down the skills into subskills after reading this book, The First 20 Hours How to Learn Anything Fast by Josh Kaufman. So one of the things he says in his book is in order to learn a skill, you have to focus on learning uh, one subskill at a time. So the problem I had was I was working through the entire problem and it required so many different skills in order to successfully do a test-driven development. Either they don't know how to analyze the problem, they didn't get understanding of the problem, and they got stuck in different stages. So I realized this has to be acquired, this skill has to be acquired one subskill at a time. So when I read this book, Coding Dojo Handbook by Emily Bosch, she has actually broken down the skills, subskills required, and how we can practice each of the subskill by focusing on just one coding exercise. And I came up with something based on her set of subskills, but I've also added my insight into this, and I'll be explaining what those things are. Okay. So the subskills she actually talks in her book is broken down into several subskills, but I have categorized them by modifying it a little bit by having just four subskills. One is the problem domain analysis, and number two is solution domain analysis. Three is designing test cases, and the last one is writing tests first. Okay, so the first one is critical because without knowing what the problem is about or having a good understanding of the problem, we cannot solve it. And the step two is solution domain analysis. It's all about solving the actual problem. First phase is just understanding the problem, and then second stage is solving the problem. And designing test cases is about what should be the very first test case, and what should be the next one, and what should the sequence of test cases you pick, and how do you know when you're done? What is your last test case? So if you go too fast and if you skip some of the test cases, you will end up in dead ends and you won't make any progress. And also writing tests first is kind of it requires shift in uh, the way you think. It requires a new mindset. So it's not easy for a beginner. So that's a separate subskill, how we can specify the behavior by using tests, which focuses on the what needs to be done, and then the production code will focus on how will be implemented. So let's look at the problem solving skills. The first two are problem domain analysis and the solution domain analysis. I have grouped them into problem solving skills. This has nothing to do with test driven development because we are not jumping into writing any code. If you go to an interview, probably they may give you a whiteboard and some color pens. You can just write what the problem is. If you can get clarifications on the problem, and the interviewer might answer those questions for you, and then you can solve the problem on the whiteboard. And you don't write any code. So you can actually ask the model questions, and you should be able to see what would happen if you use your existing model, whether it will solve the requirements. And the TDD skills are the last two of those subskills, which is designing test cases and writing tests first. So let's focus on the problem solving, the first two subskills. I will let you read this quote by Albert Einstein. So now we can see how critical it is to actually ask the right questions, whether you're in an interview or whether you're talking to a business analyst, to get a good understanding of the problem domain and what assumptions are being made. And if you have a good understanding of the scope of the problem, then it becomes a lot easy to solve the problem, because understanding the problem is probably 50% of the work in solving a problem. So this is a great book written uh, like 40, 50 years ago, How to Solve It by Greg Polya. And he actually has a very good process of going about how to solve any given problem. Even though this book is very focused on mathematics, I think it can be solved uh, in the context of programming also. So I broke down those four subskills and I realized the four phases that Greg Polya comes up with is kind of fits into those four things I have come up with. Okay, so the four phases that Greg Polya talks about in his book are: understand the problem first, devise a plan, you carry out the plan, and you look back. And these things actually go on in your mind without even thinking. By making this thinking process explicit, now we can focus on gaining skills on each of these different four phases, independent of each other. So you are comfortable actually given a problem statement, you can understand the problem, you can devise a plan, carry out the plan, and look back. Right? So let's look at each of these phases in more detail. So understand the problem phase is all about reading the verbal statement of the problem to gain a good understanding of the problem. If something is not clear, you ask the right questions to get them clarified. So you can draw a figure, you can introduce a suitable notation, you can draw a table, and you can do whatever makes you feel like, okay, I need this in order to capture this verbal statement into some other representation that makes sense to me. Okay. So the next phase is devise a plan. So we have a plan when we know what needs to be done to solve the problem. What are the things, what are the steps we need to do to solve the problem? You may come up with a flow chart. So that gives you an idea of, the sequence of steps and how the cases and what are the branches and what is the terminating condition and so on to solve the given problem. That's where you can see the idea of the solution, and you may draw diagrams in this phase. In this phase, the diagram actually represents the solution. In the previous phase, you don't solve the problem. You just gain an understanding of the problem. So this plan gives a general outline. It doesn't really actually go into details, like the flowchart is at a very high level. Or you could come up with a pseudocode that just shows you step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. What are the things you're going to do in order to solve the problem? And then comes the carry out the plan phase, and the details fit into the outline you created in the previous phase, which is the pseudocode or the flowchart you have. You use that as a guide and you refer back to it whenever you need to know what needs to be done next. And then the last step is looking back, and nobody actually comes up with a very good quality solution at the very first time they solve the problem. As you revise the problem and you look back on it, you figure out, okay, you could have improved certain things. So you reconsider and re-examine the completed solution. How can you improve this solution? We can improve any solution. We can improve understanding of the solution. So you may have the aha moment. So you could improve the performance, you could improve the readability, and you could improve a lot of things. So the four phases actually fit into the four sub-skills that I broke down in the very beginning of the presentation. The first stage is the understand the problem is nothing but the problem domain analysis in the context of software, problem solving. And the solution domain analysis is where you devise a plan. That's where you solve the problem. You come up with a flowchart, some diagrams or pseudocode to solve the given problem. That's your plan. That's your guide. Is like a map that guides you to your destination. And carry out the plan is where you actually start writing the code. You develop the code using tests. So you're doing test-driven development. You're not just writing the production code before writing the test. So some of the questions you may have is, why do we need to actually follow this process? This is useful to avoid dead ends and getting frustrated. Test-driven development is supposed to be fun. So you don't do too much of a problem domain analysis. You just do enough to solve the happy path of the entire problem. Just before coding, you don't do too much upfront design. You just enough so that you can actually get a good idea of the big picture of what the eventual solution will be. And the last phase, the look back phase, is actually the refactor phase where you can improve the structure of your code without changing the behavior. So we have seen how breaking down the test-driven development skills into sub-skills can help us focus on practicing specific sub-skill and using some case study where you can just gain understanding of the domain, and then you can solve the given problem, and then you can actually go about writing the tests and then looking back at the solution and refactoring. The next part of the presentation will actually go over some of the case studies and how I go about uh, gaining each of these subskills. What should be the deliverable? What are the activities you can do given a problem statement? How can you create some document that expresses the problem domain, and then how do you come up with a solution domain analysis document which represents the uh, process by which you go about solving the given problem. And you can also uh, write a test first and focus only on writing the test first, and then also before that you learn how to design test cases. What should be the sequence of test cases? If you acquire these skills, then you have a good grasp of test-driven development, and you can learn more advanced concepts.